And while you are working on that, Ryan, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we start the presentation, we're just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Your guys' cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. However, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat in the Q&A section and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should take less than a minute to complete. And then, yeah, this morning we will welcome you, Ryan. He is the Utility Director of Grand Island Utilities, and he will be giving us some insight into Grand Island Utilities and their 10 megawatt behind the meter solar project.
You see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is in 2023, Grand Island went down the road of looking at a 9.9 megawatt solar farm. So that's enough power to supply about 2,000 residential customers a year, 23,670 megawatt hours per year anticipated. So part of that process was we utilized Sergeant Lundy for resource planning, financial analyst. We also did a solar interconnection evaluation. And then in the end, we used GRNE Solar was our on-site who did the construction for us. And they later became Nelnet in the middle of our project. And then Baker Tilly did the submittal for us on the ITC in the end. So at the time, this list is from 2023 when we were looking at it. It was the largest municipally owned solar facility in the state. So that was what we were going in with. We had a site on the east side of town, and it was 45 acres approximately, slightly more. We looked at several sites that we own across town. This one had the highest production and the best location, being next to the substation there. We had a pre-existing 1 megawatt solar facility that we put in 2018. That was a purchase power agreement owned by another entity, which we contracted for the power off of. This one, in the end, as we'll sum up at the end, we actually end up owning. The zoning here permitted solar as well, which was a benefit. So then the question became, well, why do this? Well, the first reason is they had passed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which gave public entities the same access to PTCs and ITCs, infrastructure tax credits and power tax credits, production tax credits that the private entities had previously had. So the rules had changed. Operationally, we own wind elsewhere, and we had experience with our 1 megawatt solar farm, and we were finding that on our peak hours that the solar lined up pretty well with our node pricing. So that was a benefit. And then utilizing the 1 megawatt solar farm's history, we were able to lock down that on our peak hour of peak day, it was at 90% capacity on average over the last 5 years that we had that. So we had a pretty good idea the availability of that area. So then it became, from a financial standpoint, what are the pros and cons? So our direct expenses that we were looking at would be the initial cost to build the solar farm, the annual cost to maintain the solar farm. We would be giving up some lease revenue. We lease that out to farmers. The cost of insurance of the solar farm. And then there's a cost to generate RECs or renewable energy credits. On the other side of the equation, the tax credits we would get back as an offset. the energy sales, that would be offset, that we wouldn't have to go out and purchase through the market because it'd be generated locally. Um, the value of capacity, like every entity that generates, we have to have requirements in the Southwest Power Pool of how much capacity we have to carry, and this it acts as a load decrease to Grand Island. So that was a benefit. And then the sale of the renewable energy credits that come off the site. Um, and then to add to that, because we're put it in our distribution system, or we're looking at putting it in our distribution system on our 13.8, we were able to utilize the solar farm as a load offset or a load decrease rather than a load offset. So that means is if Grand Island were to generate 150 megawatt load demand, you would subtract that off that load demand when calculating your capacity, rather than just offsetting it with that. So, not to get too deep in the weeds, but um, the Southwest Power Pool requires a reserve margin on top of carrying the generation you need for your location. And by acting as a decrease rather than offset, you get the benefit of the nameplate that shows up that at the peak hour, plus the reserve margin benefit. So it's like a double win. And then it also uh, saves us from having to go out and buy transmission for that same load component for the city. So 1 year in, and I'll go through some more stuff here, but 1 year in with our solar farm, there were a few ebbs and flows through the construction process and the cost, but the final contract price came in about 14.3 million. Again, this was in 2023-24 process, and we were able to get back 4.2 million through our ITC credit. The net cost was $10 million to us, and so from an energy sale offset, we were able to offset $608,000 that we would have otherwise had to purchase in the SPP market. We were able to sell RECs off the site for approximately $36,000, and the equivalent capacity that offset for us that we would have otherwise had to go procure or own elsewhere, is around 688,000. So a net value of 1.3 million. So when you roll those numbers up on a solar farm, which is a 25-year asset or longer, but usually that's how they're spoken of. Just by looking at energy and RECs, if we trend as we are, that's a 15-year payback. And when you throw in the intrinsic offset value of capacity, it's really a 7.7-year payback. Keep in mind that the first year, there's usually you're going through commissioning, so you're dealing with tracker issues, different things that you're ironing out. So we actually expect the output to be slightly greater going forward than what we saw in the first year of operation. And then again, there is another savings. It's hard to quantify by not having to buy the transmission component to the energy in the market as well. We run some of our generators up to cover, which is why it's not a very easy number for us to pull out. So Grand Island's portfolio, we have coal, we have natural gas and diesel fuel, we have wind, hydro, and solar. So how those units are looked at by the market in regard to capacity. So the middle column tells you what the nameplate of that facility is, and the right-hand column tells you how SPP views that facility from an accreditation standpoint. So you can see it, for instance, any fossil fuels are basically a one-to-one offset. Wind, with the new calculations being used to determine accreditation, our wind farm's outside of town, so it doesn't have the same setup as our solar. So you get about 7 megawatts. Hydro is an interesting setup as well. It is viewed by the market the same way as solar is. So you get the same benefit as solar with our WAPA contract. But you can see our 9.9 megawatt solar farm on our peak day last year gave us the equivalent capacity offset of 10.3 because you get the nameplate, but what showed up, not the nameplate, but what showed up, plus the reserve margin. So 90% of 9.9 megawatts times 116% or 115%, it's 116 this year, gives you that number. So as we were going along, had to decide how we were going to pay for it because there are several options. We could pay for it out of cash. We could use taxable financing, or we could use tax exempt financing. And then the other options were, do you utilize the production tax credit through the government, or do you use the investment tax credit? So again, these numbers changed as we went along. Some decisions were made that altered the final cost. But up front, this was our analysis in a nutshell. So what we found was if we could pay for it by cash, we could utilize the investment tax credit and gain the best overall payback and benefit for the city. In the end, the final product, the right side is where the solar farm is right now. Again, so we built out just short of 10 megawatts on 45 acres. It ties in via 2 feeders to our substation there on the west side of Museum Drive. Another caveat to this, which we are working on right now, is we have an interruptible load locating on the north side of that substation that will be between 10 and 12 megawatts. And so large parts of the day, the output of that solar will feed that farm without ever going through our transformers. So without taxing the transformers for certain parts of the day, we can power that interruptible solar or the interruptible facility. We also own the land to the north, and has potential for, I believe, 7 megawatts of more solar at a later date. So for Grand Island, solar works out really well. We are not a NITS customer, which provides us certain caveats. And with that said, I have Lynn Mayhew on, who is the head of our production out facilities for the city and was driving this project, and he can speak more to the financing through Baker Tilly and how that process went after the fact. And I believe that's my last slide.
Good morning, everybody. To extend on Ryan's talk, as far as I'm on the prevailing wage and apprenticeship program. We hired Baker Tilly out of Chicago to monitor that portion of the project. And during that project, we were one of their first customers as far as doing a ITC program as a public entity. And so they were developing some software, and so it took a little bit longer to have them get everything right. But I'd recommend having someone with that experience tracking all the prevailing wage, and the other part of it is the apprenticeship program. And they go through and make sure that all the documentation is done correctly and that you're meeting the requirements, because if the apprenticeship program or some prevailing wage isn't met, there are fines associated with that. And we didn't meet one portion of it. There was an apprenticeship portion that wasn't met, and so that was like a $10,000 hit that we didn't get through off of our ITC. But it took from when we got it commissioned to actually getting the ITC was almost 12 months. So I would take any questions if anybody have anything on that, and I'm sure Ryan would too.
All right, it does look like we have some questions in the chat. The first one's going to be from Scott Williams, and he says, with a approximately 15-year or 7-year on a 25-year asset, does that mean that this is overall lowering your costs?
Yes. I mean, that's so, yes. After 7 years, basically, since we paid for the facility up front, we've already expended the costs. So once the payback period goes by, I mean, basically, it's all benefit side of the equation at that point. So the longer this can go on, the better. And I will caveat one thing I didn't touch on is they are, if you own one, the insurance is not super cheap to own a solar farm, as one might guess. So, I mean, that is a cost, but overall, minus some catastrophic event, I think Lynn would agree. I don't see this solar farm's life ending at 25 years. I think it can go on much longer. I think the degradation, it's like, I don't remember. It's a small percent a year they figure on the degradation of the panels as far as what they're able to generate goes down slightly each year.
The specs on that were like 0.2% per year deviation. And then I did just look at the specs on those panels last week, and those panels are expected to last 30 years.
All right, another question we have is from Tom with the City of Sydney. He is wondering, did you have any problems with harmonics or power factor issues?
No, no, and Lynn can chime in here too, but I know we connected these through two reclosers, so the field is split amongst two feeders, and so each half has its own recloser, and we fed that back to our substation. So we have fiber out there, and I know I'm getting sideways on this question, but those same two feeders tie into the interruptible load, but we have had no power factor issues to speak of.
And then we have Eric Williams. He's wondering, can you talk more about the interruptible load that will be located to the north?
Yeah, so we have a substation out here. So how Grand Island's growing is not this direction. So this substation has available capacity to start with. And by adding 10 megawatts of solar during the day, there's times that the solar can wash most of the load on the substation. So we looked at it as, okay, we have a depreciating asset in the substation. We have this new generator feeding the substation, and it's located in an area that's got an acceptable distance from any residential. To the south, what you can't see is a packing plant and our wastewater facility, the city's wastewater. So you've got high-end industrial, to the south, and the residential is further than a quarter mile to the north. I'd say closer to a half mile, maybe a third of a mile, and so it was a interesting setup, and we own the land to the north. So the contract on that is constructed in a way where the interruptible load pays us a lease payment for they're leasing about 2/3 of an acre just on the north side of the facility. They have to meet certain sound thresholds that are tested before they go live to make sure we're not impeding any neighbors. It will be a building, so this isn't your typical container type look. This will be a building, and it will have a sound dissipating wall on the intake side that helps spread out that sound. And I guess it ties onto the same two feeders, and it will. Um, we have a tariff which you can see online that helps uh, facilitate this as well. But basically, two feeders, we can give them 6 megawatts each per feeder, and it will be fully interruptible through the market. So basically, anytime that our forecast shows Grand Island will set a new peak load, or we project a new peak load that they will push us over, we have the ability to interrupt them at will for an unlimited amount of time when it comes to peak load control. Also, if we get to a period of rolling blackouts, something like that, like we had during Uri, we have the ability to take them offline. And I guess one last adder, it's not just on off either. They have the ability to throttle down. They can come off incrementally rather than all or none.
All right, thank you for that. Another question is, how are you incorporating SPP's effective load carrying capacity for solar accredited capacity going forward?
So Grand Island and I believe Hastings are two entities that are not under the NITS tariff in SPP. So we report stuff as far as what we're doing, but someone like a Lincoln or a Omaha or a MPPD, there's special rules when it comes to reporting large generator loads or large loads in general that they have to go through. So we were very careful when we went through this. We actually, Lynn and I both went down to Little Rock, Arkansas, and talked with SPP in person. And so we're kind of an anomaly in that regard. So it firmly sits behind the meter, and SPP, we kept them in the loop, but they have no real oversight on this farm.
All right, and Sharon O'Neill is wondering what the initial reaction of the community was when you initiated the project.
Strangely, Grand Island is a very blue collar community. There were a few comments as to they didn't want to see the solar pushing out the coal plant, which I thought was humorous, but maybe Lynn can chime in. But it was very, very quiet, I would say. There wasn't any much for antagonists, or I mean, it just kind of went without any political fallout in any manner.
We did have a few comments on our Facebook page when we posted it regarding, oh, the solar taking, farmland, but that land has been owned by the utilities since the early 60s.
Yeah. I mean, when you have a community of, roughly 53,000 people and your comments are, less than 10, I'd say that's pretty minimal.
All right, and Chelsea Johnson has another question. Can you explain in a little more detail how the 9.9 megawatt solar project ends up equaling over 10 megawatts in capacity value?
So how your capacity accreditation works with SPP is whatever your peak load is. So let's just take an even number. If your peak load was 100 megawatts, you have to have 100 megawatts plus they require reserve margins. So they're required you up until this year it was 15%. So this year it's 16%. So you're required if your peak load was 100 megawatts, SPP's requirement would be that you'd have to own 116 megawatts in generation resources to be able to interact in the market with energy purchases. And so when you have a standalone asset off to the side, so let's say Grand Island's requirement, which is actually more like 173, but let's use 100. If Grand Island's requirement was 100 and we have a 100 megawatt coal plant, the offset is 1-to-1 because it's you're offsetting your 100 megawatt load with 100 megawatts of this facility. When you have a solar facility that actually sits behind the meter, so instead of that 100 megawatt load, you take 10 megawatts off it, that never even shows up at your meter. So now it's that 100 megawatt load becomes 90. So now you're taking 90 times 116% rather than 100 times 116%. So you can actually magnify your capacity value beyond the rating of the facility.
All right. And did your electric customers see a decrease in their bills?
It affects our PCA, so our power cost adjustment, which a lot of municipals have, actually a lot of utilities in general have, takes into account all of the cost of your fuel and generation assets against all your sales and balances that. So obviously, because of the solar farm, we have less need for buying power off the market because it's being generated by the solar, and that in essence lowers that average into the power cost adjustment for everybody. And the interruptible load will further magnify that for us.
And another question is, can you explain a little more what you mean when you say 90% of the solar shows up?
Well, say your facility is rated at 10 megawatts. Well, when I say shows up, so what SPP requires of us from a generation side. So again, 100 megawatts, on our peak day was 100 megawatts, let's say. So they require 116 megawatts. So they're judging that what is our peak output or peak demand from the city in any given hour over the year. So what we have to do is, okay, when is that peak hour for Grand Island? And we find it, which is usually like a 5 o'clock on a Wednesday. And then at that hour where we're setting that peak that SPP is using for our generation requirement, what was the output of the solar facility as an offset? And what we're finding is during that peak hour, so it was at 9 megawatts out of 10. And there's different factors as to when the max output of your solar facility, but it's rated at 10. The question is how much actually showed up when you needed it at that peak hour, and what we were finding is about 90% output.
All right. And another question is, do you own the land or lease the land? Can the land under the panels still be used for anything?
Lynn, I'll let you take that one. You've looked at some grazing and stuff.
That land is owned by the utilities since 1963. We had previously, before putting the solar on there, we had leased it for row crops. And so we're in the process of establishing some uh, some grazing grass on there, and then we've contacted a sheep herder, and they're going to be able to put some sheep in there probably later this summer, just to control the growth of the grass that will be established. And I when we were researching the grazing, part of it is some grazers or some sheep herders will charge so much per acre to keep the grass down, but we're able to actually rent that for a small fee to have the sheep on there.
Just remember, sheep are good, goats are bad.
Yeah, goats will climb on the panel, so keep the goats away, but sheep are all right. And cattle are too big and they'll damage the panels.
And another question is, how close is your winter peak to your summer peak?
We have a pretty big delta. I want to say our summer peak is around 50 megawatts, 40 to 50 megawatts higher than our winter peak.
All right. And with SPP's changes for needing additional capacity in winter, how is your solar array performing? Are you considering adding storage?
The solar is not as good in the winter for Grand Island, and it's going to be a case by case scenario. In the summer, obviously your peak, like I said, Grand Island, for whatever reason, our peak tends to be middle of the week at say 5 p.m., which is great in the summertime. In the wintertime, your sun's either low in the sky or has set by the time that peak hits. So the solar isn't as beneficial curbing the winter peak as the summer. Um, the summer for a lot of municipals anyways is what drives us. There's a lot of everybody's got a different situation depending on what industrials you have and stuff, but there's a good number of people who have a delta like we do between summer and winter. So it is valuable in that regard. And we had peripherally looked at storage economically. It didn't pan out for us for our situation, the cost of the batteries and maintaining and the life of the battery, and then the fact that the solar's already showing up during our peak hour in the summer, which is when you'd want to discharge it. So for that reason, it didn't fit for us.
All right. And then another question is following up on the 90% shows up discussion. Are you saying SPP only cares about one peak hour in the year and how much your solar showed up during that hour? For example, not taking an average of the whole year.
Right. There you have to report annually what your peak day was and peak hour. So if it shows up during that period of the year where you're pushing your peak hour, that's when you need it. So yeah, that handful of days that is right there on the precipice, if it shows up, um, that's what you're reporting is you pick the peak hour out of the year, and that's what goes in your reporting.
All right, just a couple more questions. Is SPP treating your 9.9 megawatt solar project differently in terms of capacity value it gives you because it's behind the meter? If you had a 100 megawatt solar project, would it be subject to the ELCC accreditation methodology instead?
Yes. Yes, that comment pretty much nailed it. Yeah, because it's behind the meter, it has this structural setup we discussed. If you had a large one, it would be set up like our wind farm. And I can see if I can scroll back up there. So our wind farm is similar to what would be the reference in the 100 megawatt solar farm that was referenced in that comment. And you can see through the ELCC calculation, you're getting a fraction like 19% around there. And the thing about the ELCC is it can change annually. So the more of any one resource that comes on, the theoretically the lower that percent they give you credit for is. And when I say the more of any one resource, I'm talking about footprint wide, not per installation.
Last question so far is going to be in case of hail or tornado, what is your hazmat containment plan? How is it different from NPPDs and the trouble they had a few years ago?
Do you have any comments on that one, Lynn?
Well, our insurer is FM, and we'd work with FM to, you know, for any hazardous material collection, and get a contractor on site to take care of all that.
All right, I think we made it through all of the questions. If there's any last minute thoughts you have, feel free to stick them in the chat or the Q&A. Um, Besides that, I just want to thank you, Ryan, for all of your great information today, and thank you everyone for attending. It looks like we have something else pop up here. One last question. Are you considering another project like this?
We would not be opposed to it. SVP is always evolving and rules and regulations change, but under this current structure, um, at this juncture, like most people, our options are gas as far as future generation, gas and oil, or solar. That's Grand Island situation.
All right, we have a couple more questions still filtering in. Can you talk more about how you evaluated whether to go after the tax credit? What risks did you identify when looking into that opportunity? And did you have any difficulty getting the payment?
I'll let Lynn answer the last half. Up front, if you were to finance it through a bond, there were rules that gave you a haircut on how much you could get back through the ITC. So it was big to pay for it 100% in cash from that regard. And then, so we were fortunate enough to be carrying uh, enough excess cash above our minimum cash reserve, so it made sense for us. We picked up 2 years of a maintenance contract with the contractor who built it, and then this will be year two coming up, and then it will roll to our staff out of our. We have three gas peaking units in town, and then the 100 megawatt coal unit that we staff, and so that staff will maintain the solar farm. And I'll let Lynn comment on the last half.
As far as difficulty on getting the ITC payment, the biggest hurdle was having the contractors submit their information to Baker Tilly. They were developing a new software for that, and it was subcontractors of the subcontractor that didn't get all their information, and basically that was kind of the delay that occurred, was trying to get those subs of the subs to enter their information into the Baker Tilly software, and then Baker Tilly reviewing all that software to make sure it met all the PWNA requirements. But we went live in December of 24. We got the ITC back in December of 25.
In the ITC, we decided over the PTC. The PTC pays you back on a megawatt by megawatt basis, and with regulation changing and you never know what the future holds, it made sense to get the upfront payment. And just a warning, that payment comes in the form of a check, and so you have to transport that check. It's a little nerve-wracking, but
as far as another project like this, we have that other field that we own just north of our substation that could handle another 7 megawatts. Even if the ITC doesn't stick around, it's with the cost of new generation, it's almost viable to put in the solar at behind the meter again. But we're still evaluating that project.
and that's a good point. We've priced gas generation, and the prices have skyrocketed just in the last 6 months for gas generation, largely driven by data center demand. And so the higher baseload generation goes, the more feasible something like adding solar becomes.
All right, it looks like for questions, that's all we have so far. We do have a couple comments of just appreciation for this presentation as well as the implementation of this project. I just want to say thank you again to our speakers and thank you guys for attending. It looks like we have 15 minutes left, so we can give you an extra 15 minutes back for your Monday. I appreciate you guys all for coming and have a great day.
Thank you.